Alrighty, today we're going to be talking about the Great Divergence. And really, wanted to highlight this as really the trajectory piece of my project. In my last video, the first video that I produced, that was more of a cursory level, analyzing really why China um, had really developed iron production at such an early stage. This, rather, is more of a development on the trajectory of how England took that charge that China created and really used it on their own homeland to create larger scale industrialization. So as you can see in this photo, it's kind of an odd photo since we're talking about China in a sense, but really this is the implications, the modern implications of Chinese actions back in 1100 AD. You can see that farmland down here at the bottom and the cattle over here on the bottom right is now slowly shifting not only into, maybe if you could categorize these as suburbs, but really into industrialized cities. You can see the smokestacks rising, things being built. Things are changing abroad, and that's taking notice, and really a lot of that was due to Chinese production. The big questions we want to talk about today: why did the industrialization occur in Europe instead, and why was it different than being in China, and what innovations enabled the industrial revolution at that time? So this is more of a look at England rather than China, but we'll be doing comparisons along the way. Alrighty, so this is a global economy. As you can note, the date is a little bit different than simply looking at around 1000 to 1100 Common Era. This is a little bit more later in the centuries following. As you can see, there's lots of different trade routes, and a lot of them are coming into the newly discovered Americas at the time. You can see that there are in China. You can see the land routes, things coming up from Southeast Asia, and how Asia was then, of course, reaching out over into the Pacific Ocean. But a lot of things, if we're being honest with you, looking at those yellow dots everywhere, those are where we need to keep our eyes. Those are the colonial trade ports, which will be ever so important to not only sparking industrial revolutions, but providing resources for artisans, merchants, really just inventors on a large scale, and governments to utilize and really put a lot of large scale agriculture and or resources from the ground into industrialization. So that being said, objects of desire. This is really where China starts to come to light. So as we move away from the whole idea of internal China just being this production center and really looking at it on a globalized scale, a lot of people really in the past viewed China as this secluded kind of, I don't know, like cloud-like state. Really, that wasn't true in any sense. China was a desirable place to get into. China did not really have a ton of desires for outsiders to come and not invade, but really just to be present in their nation. So really the biggest exchange was that you had a ton of people really wanting the products of Asia, whether that's plates and things like that, really just the fine artisan work that China produced. This is the blue plates that were developed by oyster dyes, which are really interesting. And then this is, of course, Spanish gold. Pardon me, Spanish silver. That being said, Spanish silver really ended up being almost at kind of a hurting point around 1600. Reason being is because so many of the people wanted these art products and services that China produced, Southeast Asia produced, that 3/4 of the silver from Europe landed in China. And this would, of course, lead to larger scale problems later on. Here's the turning point. And the response to that shift from having the plates, really shifting to a lot of silver being in China, we have steamships and things like that being produced and really visiting China. China, after the fall of industrialization in China, that fall really marked the end of China reaching out on a large scale to try to reamp internal organizations for production and or reach out to foreigners for production. And so with that end, we kind of saw, a closing of China. Not that it was completely secluded, but that turning point when we saw that 3/4 of the world's silver was now in China, that led to really the 1842, the first Opium War, where China's fleet was fighting. As you can see, that these are the more, I wouldn't say dainty ships, but um, you can see that these ships are made out of wood compared to the opponents, which are steamships, steam coming out, and often ironside. So they were able to just tear through the Chinese monopoly of the sea, in a sense, of the southeastern Chinese seas. So now, moving on from that, that's more tangential to our topic. The larger question of history for me really goes into how does China go from being this center of the global economy, really from an early stage, having that industrialization trend start in 1100 essentially, and really work its way into around 1600, to it being a semi-colonial periphery state in the 1850s. Where is that switch? Why in the world are we seeing such a large power with so many resources, so much manpower, good positioning as well, really shift and be on the back burner in just a century or two? What happened there? So we're going to explore that. What I'll do first, I thought this was important to include because this is what I honestly thought about China previously, and this is the old narrative of what a lot of high schools, or at least what I was taught when I went through high school. So, 19th century England is modern, and everyone else isn't. England is dynamic. Okay, it's expansive, capitalist, scientific, innovation. Um, European dominance is basically the moral of the story. And that is often curtailed by, you know, racism as being a big piece of it, cultural superiority, which is a piece of it, and the European nation states are these aggressive individuals seeking, or really practicing mercantilism at the time, compared to states that they would, label China as a passive, isolated, static societies, where um, I believe this definition is very cursory. It's myopic. It needs to be better. I don't believe that it fully analyzes or gives a shot to the other countries, and I think it lifts European countries on a pedestal. And we've read books, whether that's Crosby, Anderson, things like that, that have responded to this. So, that being said, I wanted to recount that older. Let's start at the beginning. The Song Dynasty. You can see its Chinese character up there, 960 to 1279. Is this a modern state? This is really what I would characterize as the beginning of really industrialization in China. This photo is a depiction of the Song Dynasty. The Sui Dynasty, the one previous to the Song, were the ones who developed the canal system, but you could really see its effectiveness and how it was used during the Song because they were more organized as a state. So the different things that went down here, as you can see, the civil service examination produced specialized government officials, and that was a very influential thing that ended up spreading to Japan and Korea, making sure that nepotism and things like that were not the sole reason that people became a leader of a nation. And then what the canal really allowed is that granaries were able to start up. They were able to shift areas that were able to grow a lot into areas that needed a lot of food. And so that was really, they were able to almost nip famine out of the picture, in a sense. And states were managing those. So that's also that state aspect of management that we're talking about with the social welfare programs at an early stage. So these are very early stages of social welfare, but nonetheless, they are state-directed granaries that would step in if famines occurred. Government manufactures over 60 million identical iron arrowheads, so that's just mass production. So you can see that industrialization is starting to kick off because, like I mentioned in my first video, the empire or emperor really needs things to be created so he can rule, and that whether that be the military or building different infrastructure around his empire. And then huge commercial economy in urban areas. I wouldn't. I would say that this is a pseudo free market capitalism. That's why there's a big question mark there. But before we go in more in depth at it, you can see that the Song Dynasty had bureaucracy, social welfare programs, mass production, and potentially a free market capitalism. So all of these are leading and really producing ideas that hadn't been started in Europe and really would change the basis of how Europe operated at a later scale. Here's a little bit of comparisons. I really like this. This is China, and you can see how big its borders are in comparison to Europe. So you can see how massive this is and how massive China was and how many resources it had. Despite all how big China is, I would like to point out that most of China really isn't talked about in this narrative. We are talking about the Yangtze Delta, the southeastern area of China, which is over here on the right side. That is the area, and maybe you could recount the north with having the northern roads come in, maybe a little to the south with maritime trade. Most of that iron production and really that posturing of government is conducted in the capital and in areas on the southeast side. So when you're comparing China, it's not the best or the easiest to compare China as a whole because it has this massive, massive land count compared to Europe. You know, Europe looks tiny, but in real sense, we're not looking